sees this says that it looks like a green screen, but it's not. And this is really me, really in this place. And this is, of course, at Mount Stephen, or one of the adjoining mountains that, of Mount Stephen at the Burgess Shale deposit in Field, BC, or near to Field. And the photo on the right is me just outside of Ottawa at a road cut. For about 2 years when I lived here, I was a member of the EONS, which is the Eastern Ontario Natural History Society. And we did quite a few really fun field trips to different geological sites in Ottawa, a surrounding area. We went to road cuts. We went to a place in just outside of Montreal called the Hanson Brick Quarry, which has some really interesting trilobite fossils in it. But anyways, those are just some pictures of me. But I also, yes, and here's some more. This is me in Ottawa at Beechwood Cemetery, which is the place where I sourced the fossils for my very first really science-based science fair project in grade 8. Before that, I had done one that was really perfunctory, that was called My Science is for the Birds or something. And it was me trying to find out which seed the birds preferred in my backyard. But this is the first year I ever did something that was really aligned with my interests. And then the photo on the right is me with a section of one of those camaracerid cephalopods. So those ones like Camaraceris, Endoceras, the large cephalopods with straight shells. I was able to find that section at that same row cut that you see there. But really, the part that I really wanted to emphasize is the connection to the Museum of Nature. And again, I'd like to thank Dan for reminding me about this, because I might not have included this if he had not encouraged me. But I really wanted to highlight the connection to the Museum of Nature in particular. These two the photographs, I can't tell you exactly how old I was. I think probably about maybe 8 years old to 10 maybe. But the first one, of course, the place we all know, the dinosaur diorama in the fossil gallery on the first floor. And the one on the right is me listening to the small phones that they have on the benches. And this Monday afternoon, I was able to go back to the Museum of Nature after not having been there for about 5 years. And I was very excited to go again, but also quite fearful that maybe some of my favorite things had been taken away. And some things were different, but I was very happy when I entered into that diorama and I sat down and I picked up the phone and I put it towards my ear and I heard the very same audio recording that's always been playing for all those years. Maybe you've heard it, like the one, you know, we froze in a moment in late Cretaceous time. The Daspletosaurus's teeth are glinting in the sunlight. I was so happy that it was the same audio recording. But yes, that was such a joy. And I would go almost every week as a kid with my parents to this museum. And the other galleries were very nice, but the fossil one was always my favorite one. And each time I would go and listen to that. And each time it was just as amazing. And when I went there this Monday, it was still just as amazing as it always was. But anyways, and here's me with my dad when Spiclipia shaporum was unveiled in, I think, 2018 or something. I think Jordan is actually here right now. So yeah, that's you in the picture. Yes, and so that's just me. And also the other connection, this is me during the braces period, which was very painful, but also very joyous because I got to volunteer at the museum. And I still have my volunteer badge with me here today when I brought it with me. And yeah, that was the triumphant moment I got my badge. I volunteered at the, would have been 2018, I think. So Survival of the Slowest, which was that exhibition by Ray's Reptiles, as well as the butterfly habitat. And then here's me again on the left, very first science fair, which I went when I still lived in Ottawa, and I studied trilobites and Ordovician marine fossils and things. And then on the right, again, still braces, and this is me at Nationals in Fredericton, it was that year. And I went to Fredericton and I was completely amazed by the environment that they had there and the types of people I got to meet. And I never thought that, you know, I never count my eggs before they're hatched. And so when I went home, I said, it might be that I never get to experience that again, which would be totally okay because I just did. And most people aren't even lucky enough to experience it once. But I would really like to go again. So I will do everything in my power to someday, before I graduate high school, get to go back there again. And so I began what I call the Hail Mary project, which was 3 years of study of the Saskatoon fossils that I'm about to get into more detail into. But eventually I did succeed, and I've got to go back to Edmonton to CWSF, or Canada Wide Science Fair, this past year in Edmonton in May. And now I'm going to get into the actual science. I'm sure all of you are familiar with where Saskatchewan is, but I always put this in because I sometimes go to schools and people don't really know. But Saskatchewan is the square-shaped province, and Saskatoon is the largest city, though not the capital, and it's just about in the center. And this audience is unlike any that I've ever presented to, because usually I do just groups passing through a museum, or I sometimes do Ripley's Aquarium of Canada, but usually just people passing through a museum, or sometimes I'm at a school group. And so then I'm introducing people for the first time to these topics, but this audience is unique because I think everyone in here is an expert in their own field in their own right. And I have no idea the depths of your knowledge. So I'm very excited to be here today. But anyways, the time of geological time I study right now in Saskatoon is called the Quaternary period. And within that, they have the Pleistocene and the Holocene epochs. The Pleistocene was what we know as the Ice Age, when there was massive glaciations. I think those glaciations began about 2 million years ago in the Pliocene, or at least that climatic shift began around about that time. And so we have the Pleistocene, and then we have the Holocene, which comes off the final period of glaciation called the Wisconsinite. And I believe many people think that we're still in an interglacial period today, and that maybe at some point in the future, the glaciers will come back. But that's really what defines the Pleistocene versus Holocene. These fossils are from glacial lakes, which formed, but again, at the close of the last glaciation. And so there's no, at least in my resources, there's no quite way to make sure exactly what period they're from. But they're most likely from around 12,000 years ago, because that's when most agree that this particular lake existed. But I really love studying these deposits because I find they're very interesting in that we don't quite have something like these glacial lakes today, at least as they were at the end of the Pleistocene. We of course have glaciers. Here's a picture of one in the Banff Jasper area. We have mountainous glaciers. We even have continental glaciers still in Greenland and Antarctica. But one thing that we don't have, or at least not on the scale that they did back then, is the continental glacial lakes that appeared. And so at least in my view, these deposits and fossils are so valuable because they represent an ecosystem that doesn't quite exist anymore. And then again, there's just a photograph of the glaciers as they were. They went down North America, past the Great Lakes, into the States, and they also covered quite a bit of Europe and Asia. And we all know, we've all heard a lot about the Beringian land bridge that was exposed due to all this water getting sucked up into the ice, exposing the land bridge between Russia and Yukon/Alaska that animals could traverse across. And and then this is just, again, glacials versus interglacials. During the glacials, there were times of cold, glacial advance, and then the interglacials were times of glacial retreat when temperatures were a bit warmer, and some even speculate maybe warmer than today. And if you live in Ottawa, you'll of course see the evidence of the glaciations. They essentially shaped all of Canadian geography, except in those rare places where they didn't really impact much, like maybe the mountains, or but I'm not sure quite about that. The place I know most fondly, though, is the Cypress Hills in Saskatchewan. That's infamous for a place that was spared from all the effects of glaciation. And that's the reason why, when you go there, you can find these fossils of brontotheres and Archaeotherium, again, the kinds of animals that they have in the diorama on the second floor. That kind of little nook in the fossil gallery where the mammals are. And again, they have the phones there, and you can listen and you can hear. You're looking before you at a family of brontotheres. They are, so that's the area. They come from Saskatchewan. And this glacial lake, the one that I study in particular, was called Lake Saskatoon II. It was called that because during the final Wisconsin glaciation, at least in the Saskatoon area, there was a bit of back and forth. So it wasn't just one continuous period of retreat. There were some retreats and then maybe some re-advances at some point. So there was a first Lake Saskatoon and then there was a second one. But I deal with the second one. And this is a sort of crude map that I transcribed from a publication showing its approximate outline and its maximum. And the dark shape near the top of it is where and how large Saskatoon today is. So the outline of it is the outline of the city limits, at least as they are right now. And if you can even look closer, there's a small red dot. And the red dot is most of the places where I sourced my specimens from and that I'm able to base this research off of. But most of the fossils that I find, at least at this time, I believe to be trace fossils. And trace fossils I find really fascinating because even though they're not the hard parts, the bones or the teeth or what have you, they really display interesting behaviors or interesting things that happened, what types of animals were around, and a little bit of what the biodiversity was like. And again, there's always the potential that I may be wrong in some of these identifications, but I hope to be more or less correct with these. This is a trace fossil called Asterosoma. And Asterosoma is essentially a kind of rings within rings type of trace fossil. I use that phrase a lot, but I find this one specimen is really distinctive for these pyramid shapes going off in two wings. The wing on the right is a bit shorn off, but yeah, it creates this really nice semi-symmetrical shape. And here are a couple other examples. You get quite a lot of these sort of concentric Russian doll type things. Then you also have things like Edaphychnium. Edaphychnium is the name for the sort of preserved pellets, fecal pellets left behind by invertebrates like larvae and worms. This is a kind of vertical burrow, and you see lots of different pellets here. In these fossil sites, I get quite a lot of vertical sort of drilling shapes filled with these kinds of pellets. And then there's other miscellaneous burrows like Planolides. Planolides is sort of, again, miscellaneous burrow. Sometimes quite a lot of overlapping happens. Then there's Rhizocorallium. Rhizocorallium is, again, lots of crescent moons, crescent moon shapes called spreite or sprite, and they sort of happen as a result of the different movements that these worms or crustaceans or crayfish are making. Here's another one, Scolicia, another different type of burrow. Taenidium. Taenidium, this is one of my favorite ones. It again has these crescent shapes, and this burrow, in fact, goes on for quite a long time. It's in a sort of large slab of silt or clay from one of these deposits, and I've just captured a few of the most prominent sections where you can most clearly see these internesting crescent moon shapes. Then there's Tychichnus. Tychichnus is, again, more of the same, these cones, concentric rings. There's Treptichnus, which is a particularly interesting one in that it has more modern day examples that can be more easily compared. This one has something called knots in it, and a knot is essentially a breakage in the burrow that happens when in this case, a midge larva, most likely because they make identical traces today, was sort of rising up to the surface and then diving back down in the sediment, if you can imagine a dolphin almost. And it makes these breakages in the burrow, and they create these wide sweeping V shapes. Then there's Zoophycos. Zoophycos is a bit more difficult for me at this time to find or nail down because they're quite small and they're quite difficult to see unless you have a flashlight or a sort of contrasting light source. But they create these, again, concentric shapes from the pushing and burrowing that was going on. That's the last trace fossil, though. I also have a few others, other fossils. There's quite a lot of freshwater gastropods. The ones I was just showing you, the trace fossils, they come from a sort of, I'll show the color, this sort of light brown colored silt that was again deposited by Lake Saskatoon too. It's part of a certain formation called the Haltane Allo member, or Haltane Allo formation rather. And it really is across Saskatoon, but only in a few pockets can you get these really clear formations and trace fossils and such. But these come from a different deposit. This is from black clay, very nutrient-rich black clay that was most likely deposited by a slow-moving stream, maybe a pond, or maybe an interconnected network of ponds. And the snails that live here, or that are fossilized, they belong to the genus Galba, and there's two different species, at least as far as I can tell, Galba humilis and Galba bulmanoides. And these are both very small snails that don't grow much longer than 5 centimeters, but oftentimes they're only a few millimeters in length. And these are just, again, those kind of freshwater snails. They have fairly specific requirements as far as pH and water content goes. So I'm really excited to dive more deeply into that as I'm able to get more specimens and narrow down species. These are coiled ram's horn snails. Most commonly, they're called Gyrolus and Promenitus. And they're very small, again. With the Galbas, I find quite a wide age range from almost newly born hatchlings with only the smallest hint of a shell, all the way up to the adult ones that grow up to 5 centimeters or whatever the adult measurement is. But with these ones, it's only juveniles. And so that's sort of an interesting quirk about this site that, again, I'm looking forward to delving more into. Then there's Valonia. This is a terrestrial snail. And again, we're hopping around to a different deposit. There's many tiny little pockets of deposits. And I sort of combined all these together to make this presentation and to make the science fair presentation from last year. But Valonia is a terrestrial snail that lives in soils away from water. And this one was very interesting because it was found in a sand dune deposit. So in Saskatoon, on most of the outskirts of the city, you get these lacustrine sediments, this limnology type things. But if you go a bit outside the city limits, you get to these sand dune deposits that were made, again, post-glaciation. There would have been a lot of lakes, a lot of streams, but also these kind of arid dunes. And I was splitting these just in the hope of maybe finding something, and suddenly this little snail shell peeked out at me. And I just find it very interesting. Then again, getting into more minutia, this is called, I get quite a lot of these shapes, and they look essentially like a button. It's a round shape with 4 evenly spaced holes, sometimes 3, but sometimes even 2, but most often 4. And this is quite likely a diatom, cyclotella, which is a kind of big cosmopolitan genus of diatoms. They're quite versatile. They live in many different water conditions and habitats. And so there's quite a lot of these, but strangely no other diatoms, at least not that I've found. Then there's plant fossils, which I particularly am fond of. The plant fossils they come in many different forms. Some of them are carbonized. And if you zoom in on the carbonized ones, you can actually see the lines, the longitudinal lines that go down the stem of a grass or maybe a water reed type of plant. But these are most similar to grasses. This is a carbonized one, and this one has been replaced by a different mineral, maybe calcite, maybe something similar. But it turns this brilliant orange color. And again, if you zoom in, you see the lines and the various features of the leaf or the stem. You also get a few different things. You get little geological things that I really enjoy looking at. These are mud cracks. I most commonly call them mud cracks, but their scientific name is desiccation cracks. And they occur, again, when the water withdraws, when there's a cracking, a drying out, and then they are filled back and creating these sort of raised ridges that form the shapes of the desiccation cracks. And then finally, I know this picture was used in the document that came out before this, but these are some barbs. I have a bit better ones now, but this is still one of the best photographs I have. Barbs are things that you find quite often in glacial lakes, and still even sometimes lakes today. I believe Crawford Lake has these, and they're essentially, I call them fossilized time, because they're sort of evidence of the passage of time in that the dark layers represent winter seasons and the lighter ones represent the summer seasons, generally speaking. And that's because in a lake, when you're in a lake environment, in the summertime, there's quite a lot of activity. There are animals swimming, rain coming in, streams coming in, just generally things that disturb the water and kick up the different particles that have been brought in by streams. And in those kind of circumstances, the only particles that are able to settle are the heaviest ones, the largest ones. But then when winter comes and the streams freeze, the rain turns into snow, the lake freezes over, many of the different animals go into hibernation. It gets much more quiet and much more still. And then those finer particles are finally able to settle down, which creates this contrasting back and forth between the light and the dark. And so finally, yeah, I just have a few more slides of the map of the lake. Much of what I know about this lake is based on a massive paper that was written by a graduate student in I think, geography or maybe even engineering, like architecture, building buildings, that was written in about 1960s. And they did a huge monograph essentially about this lake and about its size, about its distribution, what kind of sediments were across the province. And they had there was a bit at the end where they speculated that they rather believed that there was a sort of drainage event near the end of this lake's life, and that quite a bit of the water was washed out, going maybe to the ocean, to Hudson's Bay area, just to other water bodies. And a lot of this water was drained out and the borders shrunk quite a bit. And they thought this was quite likely. I can't remember quite why, but they didn't have very much evidence to rely on to make this claim. They just said it was quite likely. And so I thought it was interesting that in essentially the middle of the lake at its maximum, or what the middle would have been, I keep finding these various deposits and fossils that indicate terrestrial or terrestrial adjacent things, like these plants that wouldn't quite live in the center of the lake, or these trace fossils, like this one, for example, that was mostly made by a midge larva. And again, just things that would be more towards the shoreline. So when I was at the science fair, I was trying to emphasize that it's interesting that perhaps this could be used as more evidence to support this hypothesis that the lake had a drainage event, and that actually they said that the shoreline likely receded to south of Saskatoon, which is indeed where I find all these coastal fossils. And anyways, this is the last slide. This exists more so to just remind me of what to talk about before I forget. Just the significance of these types of fossils, why I find them interesting and why I believe they're significant. First of all, there's climate change. Right now, we're in a period where everyone wants to know more about climate change. Everyone wants to know what kinds of things we might predict, how we can look at it, how we can sort of speculate about species distribution, what will happen to certain species, how habitats might shift. And so just generally, I think it's these end glacial deposits represent a really valuable resource, and as well as things like Crawford Lake, of course, things that we can use to observe how organisms change over time, how they're affected by these massive climatic shifts, and what we might expect going forward. And then I made a note of paleogeography. It relates to this lake, where its shoreline might have been. Then there's the glacial lakes themselves. Through these fossils, I'm able to kind of speculate or hypothesize about what these conditions might have been like. These diatoms, these cyclotella, they are, again, quite a prolific diatom. They live in lots of different water bodies, and they are the only ones that are found in the sediment. I've searched pretty exhaustively. There aren't any other, at least not that I've seen, any other types of diatom other than this cyclotella or whatever its genus may end up being. And that could mean that it was an oligotrophic lake, which means lack of nutrients, generally speaking, and low oxygen levels in the bottom, getting higher as you go to the shallower depths. And that's the sort of environment where these diatoms take over, at least in modern times. And then there's the seasonality. There's quite a lot of these mud cracks across these deposits. It follows a very a one-for-one almost association, and that there'll be a layer of desiccation cracks, a shallow layer of fossils, another layer of desiccation cracks over and over and over again. And so this might indicate that there was a lot of recession of the lake's borders or its shorelines, and there was a lot of drying out, a lot of heat. Then there's oxygen content, as I said before. These diatoms might indicate oligotrophy or low oxygen content. But then, of course, there's these invertebrates that had to have been around making these trace fossils, these zoophycos, these things that are most likely worms, aquatic worms, crustaceans like a crayfish or beetle larva, but all of them, generally speaking, aquatic, and all of them needing oxygen to survive. And so maybe it was this type of situation that I'm describing with oligotrophy, or perhaps it's shifted, shifted. I'm forgetting the word, but shifted back and forth essentially between higher oxygen and lower oxygen. And then finally, I just made a note of species distribution. It's interesting to know what types of gastropods were around and when, which types of invertebrates. It's almost impossible to tell specifically what species of invertebrate made many of these, except for maybe the Triptichinus, which was most likely made by midges. But it's hard to describe, but the more we can map out where these invertebrates were, I think the more we can narrow down what exactly the biodiversity was like of these lakes, what types of invertebrates were around, in what numbers were they, how diverse were they, and then there's the gastropods as well, the plants, what kinds of plants were growing, what kinds of gastropods were able to survive in the streams and ponds that were feeding or being fed by this glacial lake. So that's the last